3,249 points. According to the official college basketball historical registry, that is the exact monumental figure Freeman Williams delivered, firmly securing the second spot in the entire history of Division I basketball at the time. A player with that kind of formally documented, undeniable firepower should be a celebrated global icon today, heavily featured in every historical documentary. Furthermore, publicly available statistical databases confirm a highly uncomfortable reality for modern executives. He still ranks among the top 10 players in the entire history of the professional league for points scored per minute during his first 4 seasons. Yet the league completely erased him. They actively buried his legacy, deliberately scrubbing his name from the glorious retrospectives and modern television broadcasts. How does a generational athletic anomaly just vanish into thin air without a massive public outcry? When you process historic numbers like that, a giant, undeniable red flag immediately goes up. Investigative reports from major sports media at the time noted his efficiency was absolutely terrifying to opposing coaches, calling him an unguardable force on the hardwood. But behind the closed locker room doors, a completely different, highly scandalous story was unfolding. The public records and his own subsequent interviews reveal a severe struggle with a devastating dependency, a highly destructive dark side of fame that the organization desperately needed to sweep under the rug. The multi-billion-dollar league had to protect its family-friendly image and highly lucrative television contracts at all costs. What exactly were they hiding from the fans? Instead of saving their brightest star, they completely stripped him of his elite status, quietly exiled him into the minor leagues, and left him to fight his own demons in absolute silence. This was not a tragic accident. It was a carefully calculated corporate cover-up. The sports world loves a profitable hero, but it absolutely despises a financial liability. To uncover the full truth behind this ruthless cancellation and the millions of dollars lost in the shadows, we must return to the fall of 1974. We have to examine the exact moment the most prominent national scouts first opened their notebooks, completely unaware of the dark, highly scandalous path that awaited their newest multi-million-dollar obsession. The foundation of any great sports tragedy usually starts on the concrete. For Freeman Williams, the story began under the relentless, unforgiving sun of Southern California. According to public biographies and verified civic records, he came into this world on May 15, 1956. That specific date in 1956 is crucial context because he grew up during a highly turbulent time in Los Angeles, a period where the neighborhood courts were absolute battlegrounds. You either learned to put the ball in the hoop against grown, aggressive men, or you were forcefully run off the asphalt. Freeman developed a unique, almost arrogant style of play. He became a relentless shooter who refused to acknowledge any authority on the court, playing with a chip on his shoulder that bordered on hostility. During his time at Manual Arts High School, whispers began to circulate throughout the city about a skinny teenager who could shoot from anywhere in the gym, completely defying the conventional coaching wisdom of the time. But how did a raw, undisciplined street player transition to organized, elite college athletics? In the historical archives of the university, it is heavily documented that in the fall of 1974, Freeman Williams officially enrolled at Portland State. That year, 1974, marked the undeniable turning point from local playground legend to a rising national phenomenon. In the scouting reports from that summer, evaluators described him as an unstoppable offensive weapon, though completely uninterested in playing defense. And this brings us to a compelling realization and a serious question. The university was taking a massive financial and reputational gamble on a player who played entirely by his own rules. Would his street ball mentality destroy the team chemistry, or would it elevate the program to unprecedented national heights? No one in Portland could have possibly anticipated what was coming next. They handed the keys to the offense to this unpredictable freshman, completely unaware that he was about to force the statisticians to rewrite the entire record book, putting up numbers that would make the most seasoned coaches absolutely lose their minds. Imagine trying to score almost 40 points in a single professional or collegiate basketball game. Now, imagine doing it without the benefit of a three-point line. Every single shot had to be earned the hard way, fighting through aggressive defenders in a crowded physical paint. This was the impossible reality that Freeman Williams created during his college tenure. According to the official Collegiate sports reference statistics, he averaged an earth-shattering 38.8 points per game during the 1976 to 1977 season. Let that sink in for a moment. 38.8 points per game. In modern basketball, hitting that average for a single week is a monumental achievement, but he sustained it for an entire season. But how did a single player monopolize an entire team's offense to such an extreme degree without facing a revolt in the locker room? In the archival materials of the Portland State Hall of Fame, there is a formally recorded fact that highlights this sheer dominance. Freeman Williams had exactly 41 career games where he scored 35 or more points. 41 individual games of absolute, undisputed offensive destruction. When we review the game transcripts and retrospective interviews from his former teammates, a complicated picture emerges. Sports journalists of the era often noted in their columns that Freeman operated with the supreme arrogance of a solitary hunter. He would routinely take 30 to 40 shots a night, sometimes completely ignoring wide-open teammates. This raises a fascinating psychological question for our investigation. Was he genuinely carrying an untalented team on his shoulders, or was he already exhibiting a profound selfishness that would eventually poison his professional career? He possessed the ultimate green light, and the local crowds worshipped him for his spectacular displays. However, the true hysteria among the national sports media was still brewing in the background. The tension was building toward a specific, freezing night in February of 1978, when the scoreboard in the arena would light up with a number that seemed physically impossible for a human being to achieve. Let us travel back to a freezing night in February of 1978, a month that officially entered the university logs as the setting for one of the most absurd offensive performances ever recorded. The opponent was Rocky Mountain College, and the atmosphere in the gymnasium was electric with anticipation. But nobody in the stands, not even the coaching staff, could have predicted the absolute destruction that Freeman Williams was about to unleash on the hardwood. According to the official box score from that exact game, Freeman scored an unbelievable 81 points. 81. To put this monumental number into perspective, he dropped 54 points in the first half alone. When we analyze the formal shooting statistics, the sheer volume is staggering. He made 37 out of 56 field goal attempts. How does a single human being physically take 56 shots in a 40-minute game without completely exhausting himself? In a retrospective interview, Freeman himself explained it as slipping into a trance, a state where the rim looked like an ocean and every flick of his wrist felt destined to go in. However, this historic box score raises a massive investigative question. If a player is dominating his opponent so thoroughly that the opposing defense looks like traffic cones, why did the major scouts sitting in the bleachers look so concerned? Reporters covering the game noted in their public recaps that his individual brilliance came at a heavy cost to the team dynamic. He was a one-man army, and while the crowd roared in approval of his historic 81-point explosion, the professional evaluators were quietly whispering about his complete refusal to pass the ball. The professional leagues demand more than just a spectacular soloist. They require a player who understands the complex geometry of a team system. Despite these glaring red flags, the undeniable allure of his scoring gravity was impossible to ignore. His name was rocketing to the top of every scout's clipboard. With such a terrifying statistical resume, the upcoming professional draft was supposed to be a red carpet, leading him directly to a massive, multi-million-dollar contract. He had the talent, he had the numbers, and he had the attention of the entire nation. Yet, as he prepared to step onto the grandest stage of his life, the executives in the front offices were already scheming, preparing a ruthless trap that would permanently alter the trajectory of his promising career. The hype surrounding Freeman Williams leading up to the professional selection process was nothing short of a media frenzy. He was no longer just a local legend. He had become a certified, nationally recognized offensive anomaly. According to the official award registries from 1978, he was proudly named to the second All-American team. This was not some minor regional accolade. This formally placed his name directly alongside future icons of the sport, legends who would go on to define the next decade of basketball. The anticipation reached its absolute peak when the Boston franchise, arguably the most prestigious and demanding organization in the history of the sport, utilized their 8th overall pick to select him. The official draft archives from 1978 clearly list Freeman Williams as the prized rookie destined to wear the iconic green and white uniform. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the perfect marriage. The Boston front office, desperate for a pure shooter to inject life into their aging roster, had supposedly found their savior. But here is where the story takes a sharp, highly suspicious turn. If you look through the historical game logs of the Boston franchise, you will discover a completely baffling reality. Freeman Williams never played a single official minute for them. His jersey never touched the iconic parquet floor. In the frantic reports filed by sports journalists covering the team during that summer, there was a profound sense of confusion. How does a team use an incredibly valuable 8th overall pick on a generational scorer, only to completely discard him before the season even begins? The official explanation given to the press involved strategic roster retooling, but investigative reporters at the time smelled a rat. The reality was far more cynical and business-driven than anyone on the outside could have possibly understood. He was not drafted to be the future star of Boston. He was drafted purely as a high-value asset, a shiny bargaining chip in a massive game of corporate chess. He thought he had reached the mountaintop, securing his financial future and athletic legacy. However, it was far too early to celebrate that lucrative Boston contract. Behind closed doors, away from the flashing cameras and naive fans, the billionaire owners were finalizing the paperwork for the most outrageous and sweeping backroom deal the league had ever witnessed, a transaction that would completely blindside the young rookie by August. To understand the brutal nature of professional sports, you must look past the cheering crowds and focus strictly on the boardroom paperwork. On the 4th of August, 1978, the league officially processed a transaction so massive and unprecedented that it completely shocked the sports world. According to the official transaction logs from that specific date, 2 prominent franchise owners executed a bizarre, multi-layered swap of their entire organizations. The owners essentially traded cities, moving operations from Boston to California, and in the process, they shuffled players around like expendable poker chips. The public documents surrounding this massive corporate reshuffle revealed that 13 different players and draft picks were involved in the chaos. 13 lives uprooted in a single afternoon. And right in the middle of this dizzying legal paperwork was Freeman Williams. The Boston executives had used him as a crucial piece of leverage to finalize this monstrous deal, immediately shipping him off to the newly formed San Diego franchise. He was discarded before he even had a chance to prove his worth on the court. In the memoirs of league insiders and the investigative articles published in the aftermath, journalists heavily criticized the blatant commodification of the athletes. For Freeman, the psychological blow was immense. He went from being the highly touted savior of a legendary sports dynasty to an unwanted cast-off, exiled to a struggling team with a notoriously chaotic front office. But the geographical shift to Southern California carried a far more dangerous consequence than just a bruised ego. San Diego in the late 70s was a vibrant, sun-soaked city overflowing with newly minted millionaires, endless parties, and a dark, seductive nightlife. The team had deep pockets, the media pressure was surprisingly low, and the temptations were absolutely everywhere. The front office handed him a massive paycheck, but provided zero veteran leadership or structure to guide him. Finding himself utterly isolated in California, surrounded by individuals who cared more about the after-party than the playbook, Freeman Williams walked right into a perfect storm. It was in this glittering, chaotic environment that he was first introduced to the dangerous substances that would quickly begin to erode his phenomenal talent, setting the stage for a catastrophic and highly public downfall. Welcome to Southern California, at the tail end of the 1970s. The sun is shining, the money is flowing freely, and for a young athlete with a freshly minted professional contract, the temptations are absolutely everywhere. Freeman Williams found himself thrust into the chaotic environment of the San Diego franchise. On the surface, the transition seemed somewhat successful, at least offensively. According to the official professional league statistics, he averaged 16.6 minutes per game during his debut 1978 to 1979 season. 16.6 minutes might not sound like a grueling workload, but the way he utilized that limited time was completely terrifying to opposing defenses. He was an absolute spark plug, an offensive genius who could ignite the scoreboard the second his sneakers touched the hardwood. However, behind those flashy jump shots lay a massive, glaring flaw that coaches could not ignore. He played basketball as if the defensive half of the court simply did not exist. In the investigative reports of the era, sports journalists consistently noted the stark contrast between his breathtaking scoring ability and his complete refusal to stop anyone on the other end. Despite this glaring imbalance, his sheer offensive will force the league to recognize him. The public award archives formally record that in December of 1980, Freeman Williams achieved something extraordinary. He became the very first player in the history of the San Diego franchise to be named the Player of the Month. But while the press was busy singing his praises and printing his picture in the local papers, a dark and insidious shadow was creeping into the locker rooms across the entire professional landscape. The late 70s and early 80s were notoriously plagued by an epidemic of illicit substances, a dangerous white powder that was quietly destroying the careers of young millionaires. The players had too much cash, far too much free time, and zero supervision. In retrospective interviews, former players described an atmosphere of absolute indulgence, where late-night parties were fueled by devastating habits that the league office desperately tried to conceal. So, a critical question emerges from this glittering Californian mirage. Was Freeman Williams, the newly crowned Player of the Month, spending his evenings studying game film? Or was he already spiraling into the dangerous nightlife that surrounded his new team? The media kept painting him as a rising star, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb in the locker room. But while the reporters cheered, his head coach, Paul Silas, was staring hard at the formal game transcripts, and what he saw in those papers was a terrifying anomaly that forced him to take absolutely unprecedented measures before the season fell completely apart. Imagine holding the ultimate offensive weapon in your hands, yet deliberately choosing to keep it locked away in a drawer for most of the battle. This was the bizarre, highly controversial reality constructed by head coach Paul Silas during the early 1980s. To understand the sheer absurdity of the situation, we have to look closely at the verified numbers. According to the comprehensive basketball reference databases, Freeman Williams averaged a staggering 19.3 points per game during the 1980 to 1981 season. 19.3 points is a figure that usually commands massive respect, securing a player a permanent spot in the starting lineup and ensuring heavy media coverage. But then you look at the second column of that formal statistical report, and you see a number that makes absolutely no logical sense. The official game logs confirm that he achieved this remarkable scoring output while playing only 24.1 minutes per contest. Let that sink in. 24.1 minutes. Historically, he is widely recognized in sports archives as the only player to ever average more than 18 points while spending less than 25 minutes on the floor. This was an unprecedented statistical anomaly. How does a team's most lethal scorer spend more than half the game sitting on the bench wrapped in a warm-up jacket? Reporters hounded the coaching staff for answers, demanding to know why this offensive genius was being kept on such a remarkably short leash. In the post-game press conference transcripts, the coaching staff often offered vague excuses about defensive matchups and tactical rotations. But investigative journalists digging deeper into the team dynamics suspected a far more troubling narrative. The strict limitation of his playing time was not a strategic masterstroke. It was reportedly an act of sheer desperation. Head coach Paul Silas was allegedly trying to manage a player who was becoming increasingly erratic and unreliable. If you let him play 35 minutes, his lack of defensive effort and his unpredictable behavior might completely destroy the team's fragile structure. The front office was desperately trying to maintain his trade value by highlighting his brief, explosive scoring bursts while hiding his glaring deficiencies from the rest of the league. It was a high-stakes game of smoke and mirrors. The coaching staff believed they could control the narrative by keeping his shifts incredibly brief. They tried to keep him tightly contained, heavily managing his minutes to hide the worsening reality. But concealing a secret of this magnitude in a locker room full of young athletes is virtually impossible, and by the beginning of 1982, incredibly dark and damaging whispers began to echo through the league corridors. The glossy facade of the San Diego franchise was beginning to crack, and the devastating truth was slowly leaking out to the public. Behind the closed doors of the training facility, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Teammates began to notice bizarre, unpredictable mood swings. One day, Freeman Williams would arrive at the gym, radiating an almost manic, unstoppable energy, and the very next morning, he would appear completely detached, struggling to maintain basic focus during routine drills. In the investigative memoirs published years later by league insiders, these erratic behavioral patterns were frequently highlighted as the glaring symptoms of a much deeper, life-altering dependency. The whispers in the locker room grew louder with every passing week. What was he really doing during his off hours in the sprawling Californian metropolis? The front office executives were caught in a terrible bind. They possessed a player with undeniable, crowd-pleasing talent, but his off-court struggles were becoming an open secret that threatened to blow up in their faces. According to his official player performance logs, the breaking point arrived during the 1981 to 1982 season. The formal statistics show that he appeared in a mere 37 games for the San Diego squad that year, before abruptly vanishing from their roster. 37 games is less than half a season. Why would a team suddenly sideline their most efficient scorer just as the winter campaign was heating up? The answer lies in the league transaction registries. In January of 1982, the San Diego executives finally pulled the trigger on a highly controversial move, officially trading him to the Atlanta Hawks. The trade was quietly framed as a mutual parting of ways, a chance for a fresh start. But seasoned sports reporters knew better. In their syndicated columns, they openly questioned the true motives behind the sudden transaction, suggesting that the Californian front office was desperately dumping a toxic asset before his market value plummeted to absolute zero. They wanted him out of their city before the situation resulted in a massive public scandal. Atlanta, desperate for scoring, took the gamble. They genuinely hoped that a change of scenery and a more disciplined environment in Georgia would instantly revive the career of this incredible marksman. But the executives in Atlanta were walking into a massive trap. They thought they were acquiring an offensive superstar ready for redemption, but the terrifying figures in the medical reports and the performance data from his very first games would soon reveal that they had just purchased a completely broken man. When Freeman Williams arrived in Atlanta, the front office truly believed they had executed the steal of the century. They thought a simple change of scenery and a strict new coaching staff would instantly cure whatever mysterious ailments were secretly plaguing their newly acquired star. But the harsh, undeniable reality of professional sports is that an athlete can never simply run away from his own destructive habits. Almost immediately after he put on the new jersey, the training staff noticed something was terribly wrong with his fundamental mechanics. The once effortless, lightning-fast shooting stroke, the exact same stroke that used to terrify the entire nation, had completely vanished. According to the official box scores published by the league office, his scoring average plummeted to a highly unrecognizable 4.8 points per game. 4.8. How does a grown man who once effortlessly scored 81 points in a single collegiate evening suddenly struggle to hit even 5 points in a full professional contest? This was not just a minor temporary shooting slump. This was a catastrophic, systemic physical failure. In the internal medical evaluations and scouting reports leaked to the press years later, it was heavily documented that his reaction time had slowed significantly and his legendary baseline stamina was completely gone. He managed to stumble like a ghost through merely 23 games for the Atlanta franchise before the executives hit the absolute panic button. The front office realized they were harboring a rapidly sinking ship, and they desperately scrambled to unload his guaranteed contract. In a humiliating turn of events, the once coveted first-round draft pick was unceremoniously shipped off to the Utah franchise for pennies on the dollar. The cold mountains of Salt Lake City offered absolutely no salvation for a man in his condition. The public transaction registries confirm that Freeman Williams appeared in exactly 18 games wearing the Utah uniform during the 1982 to 1983 season. 18 brief, uninspired appearances, and then absolute, deafening silence. He was quietly erased from the highest level of basketball without so much as a farewell press conference. Journalists of the time diplomatically wrote about a tragic loss of motivation and chronic fatigue, actively avoiding the terrifying truth. But years later, the undeniable financial facts would surface, forcing us to ask a very dark question. Where exactly were those massive million-dollar paychecks going while his physical career was actively disintegrating on the court? The terrifying answer lay hidden in the darkest corners of his personal life, pointing directly toward a severe chemical dependency that would eventually drain every single cent from his bank accounts and leave him begging for a second chance. To fully comprehend the sudden, violent evaporation of his Hall of Fame potential, we have to pull back the heavy curtain on the most tightly guarded secret of the early 1980s professional athletic scene. The league front offices across the country were absolutely terrified of the rapidly spreading epidemic of illicit substances, specifically the expensive, highly addictive white powders that were quietly consuming their young millionaires in the locker rooms. The executives desperately needed to protect their highly lucrative television contracts and maintain a family-friendly corporate image. So, instead of offering expensive rehabilitation or public support, they simply discarded the problematic assets into the shadows. Freeman Williams became the ultimate, tragic victim of this ruthless corporate sweeping. In the highly publicized retrospectives and investigative pieces written decades later, the devastating truth finally emerged for the public to see. The millions of dollars he had earned through his phenomenal talent were completely incinerated by a ferocious, uncontrollable habit that dictated his every waking moment. In a remarkably candid interview published by the Portland Tribune years after his exile, Freeman Williams gave a chilling quote about his darkest days in the shadows. He stated on the formal record that considering the massive, reckless quantities of illicit substances he consumed, it is a medical absolute miracle that he did not lose his life. He openly admitted that he was supposed to perish during that dark, chaotic era. When you read a heavy statement like that in a published interview, a terrifying investigative question immediately arises. Who was supplying a struggling, isolated athlete with such lethal amounts of contraband while the team executives conveniently looked the other way? The official historical encyclopedias of the Basketball League confirm a brutal, undeniable fact regarding his timeline. His career at the absolute highest professional level lasted for exactly 6 incomplete seasons. 6 abruptly shortened seasons. That is a mere fraction of what was universally predicted for a young man possessing his unprecedented scoring gifts. The unforgiving system had chewed him up, extracted his most explosive, entertaining years for ticket sales, and then aggressively spit him out onto the street when his personal demons became too expensive and embarrassing to hide. Stripped of his massive sneaker contracts, completely alienated from his wealthy peers, and facing a mounting army of aggressive debt collectors, the former superstar was forced to swallow his massive pride. In the autumn of 1984, with absolutely zero leverage left to his name, he sat in a dingy, unlit office and signed a humiliating legal document that officially banished him to the grueling, unforgiving purgatory of the minor leagues. Imagine the profound psychological torment of going from sold-out, glaringly bright professional arenas where thousands of adoring fans chanted your name to freezing, half-empty high school gymnasiums located in the middle of absolute nowhere. This was the brutal, unglamorous reality of the Continental Basketball Association in the mid-1980s. It was a notoriously rough, drastically underfunded league, universally known among insiders as a chaotic dumping ground for broken prospects, aging veterans, and exiled outcasts. For Freeman Williams, it represented the absolute bottom of the professional barrel, but it was also the only place left on earth that would willingly hand him a paycheck to feed his lingering, expensive dependencies. According to the official minor league archival rosters, he spent the 1984 to 1986 seasons playing for a forgotten franchise known as the Tampa Bay Thrillers. The financial contrast between his past and present was absolutely staggering. In the financial audits and player contract records of that specific minor league, it was thoroughly documented that the athletes were earning mere pennies, completely stripped of the lavish hotel accommodations and massive performance bonuses they had previously grown accustomed to. Yet, amidst the punishing 12-hour bus rides and the grueling, highly physical style of play in those tiny gyms, a strange phenomenon occurred. Deprived of the blinding media spotlight and the crushing expectations of the national press, the pure, unadulterated scoring genius hiding deep inside Freeman Williams briefly flickered back to life. He was playing against desperate, hungry men fighting every night for their professional survival, yet he somehow managed to dominate them with the exact same arrogant, effortless flair he had shown back in college. The verified Registry of Minor League Historical Awards formally notes that in 1985, he not only led the gritty Tampa Bay squad to a highly contested championship title, but he was also officially crowned the most valuable player of the playoffs. How does a physically compromised man, actively battling severe internal demons and chronic exhaustion, manage to completely take over a professional championship series? This spectacular, totally unexpected resurgence sent massive ripples through the underground scouting community. Rumors began to circulate rapidly that the legendary scoring machine had finally been repaired and disciplined. The executives in the major league front offices, always greedy and desperate for a cheap, proven offensive spark off the bench, started reviewing the grainy VHS footage arriving from Florida. This sudden burst of undeniable brilliance forced the strict scouts to reconsider their blacklists, and by the fall of 1985, a highly unexpected, almost miraculous contract offer materialized on his agent's desk, promising exactly one final, desperate shot at redemption. The sudden, highly publicized championship run in the minor leagues briefly blinded the major front offices to the glaring underlying physical reality of their former star. In the autumn of 1985, Freeman Williams found himself holding a miraculous, fully guaranteed contract to return to the highest level of professional basketball. The Washington franchise, absolutely desperate for a proven offensive weapon to spark their sluggish second unit, decided to take an enormous, highly calculated financial gamble. But the brutal, unforgiving nature of professional sports is that the human body always keeps a meticulous, terrifyingly accurate receipt of past abuses. According to the official game logs carefully preserved by the league, his highly anticipated grand return amounted to exactly 9 official appearances on the hardwood, just 9 games. Why did a savvy front office invest significant financial resources into a legendary scorer, only to abruptly bench him after less than 10 matches? The devastating answer was not hidden in his shooting form, but in his rapidly deteriorating physical foundation. In the internal medical assessments and scouting reports leaked from that very brief period, evaluators painfully noted that the explosive, effortless lift on his jump shot was completely gone. At 29 years old, an age when most elite athletes are entering their absolute, untouchable prime, his body was responding like a heavily battered veteran a full decade older. The formal statistical registries confirm this tragic decline, showing he managed a mere 7.7 points per game, barely surviving an average of 12.2 minutes on the court before severe exhaustion completely overtook him. This was not the arrogant, high-flying phenomenon who once terrified entire defensive schemes. This was a broken shadow desperately trying to mimic former glory. As the Washington front office quietly processed his final release papers, cutting their financial losses to avoid public embarrassment, the harsh reality finally set in. The heavy, dark doors of the premier professional league were slamming shut permanently. He was entirely out of options on American soil, heavily pursued by aggressive creditors and completely isolated from his former wealthy peers. But just as the national sports media prepared to write his final sporting obituary, a bizarre, entirely unexpected lifeline emerged from the other side of the planet. Faced with mounting undeniable financial ruin, Freeman Williams packed a single bag, grabbed his passport, and purchased a one-way ticket leading directly to Manila. Imagine fleeing from massive, crushing financial debts and a ruined domestic reputation, only to suddenly land in an exotic, wildly unpredictable environment where the local fans immediately treat you like an absolute deity. This was the incredibly surreal, high-stakes atmosphere of the Philippine professional circuit in the late 1980s. It was a fiercely physical, wildly entertaining league that actively recruited exiled American stars, offering them generous cash envelopes and a completely clean slate away from the highly judgmental eyes of the national press. In the officially archived contracts of the International League, it is formally documented that in 1987, Freeman Williams signed a highly lucrative agreement to play for a local powerhouse officially known as the Tandway Rum Masters. Why would a player who just failed a major physical evaluation in Washington suddenly fly across the Pacific Ocean to play in an unair-conditioned arena? The answer was simple: undeniable financial survival. But what happened next absolutely defied all medical logic and sporting expectations. Placed in a chaotic system that worshipped pure, unadulterated offensive volume, the damaged veteran experienced a miraculous, blinding flash of his former collegiate brilliance. According to the official, meticulously preserved game protocols of the Philippine League from that specific season, Freeman Williams unleashed a terrifying offensive barrage, officially scoring an unbelievable 82 points in a single regulation match. To fully grasp the sheer magnitude of this international explosion, the historical box scores explicitly indicate that he successfully converted exactly 10 three-point attempts during that exact game. 10 deep, heavily contested shots in an era where the three-point line was still treated as a bizarre novelty. In the published articles by international reporters who witnessed the historic event, they described a man playing with pure, reckless desperation, firing from every conceivable angle on the court. However, this historic 82-point performance immediately forces us to ask a highly cynical, investigative question. Was this a genuine, sustainable athletic resurrection? Or was it merely the final, blinding flare of a dying star burning through its very last physical reserves? The massive cash payouts from Manila temporarily kept the aggressive debt collectors at bay, but an athlete cannot hide from his internal demons forever, even on an exotic archipelago. By the dawn of the 1990s, the international well had completely dried up, forcing him to reluctantly pack his bags and face the harsh, unforgiving concrete realities waiting for him back in Los Angeles. The devastating fall from the bright international spotlight back to the brutal, sun-baked asphalt of Southern California was incredibly swift and totally unforgiving. In the early 1990s, Freeman Williams was no longer a highly touted professional draft pick or an international scoring sensation. He was just another forgotten ghost wandering the local neighborhood courts, desperately trying to hustle for small cash prizes just to survive another week. According to his deeply investigated public biographical data, the dark period stretching from the late 1980s into the early 1990s saw him bouncing aimlessly between completely obscure, deeply underfunded regional teams, briefly appearing on the official rosters of forgotten squads like the Pensacola Tornadoes. But why was a man who once effortlessly dropped 81 points on national television suddenly playing in empty gymnasiums for absolute scraps? The tragic, unspoken truth was that his shattered reputation absolutely preceded him everywhere he went, making him completely untouchable to any serious professional organization in the country. The definitive final nail in his formal athletic coffin is meticulously recorded in the transaction histories of the minor circuits, which clearly show that his very last documented professional attempt occurred in 1993 with the Miami Tropics. After that brief, highly unsuccessful stint, he retreated completely to the legendary, heavily contested streetball courts of Venice Beach. Here, surrounded by rusty chain-link fences and unforgiving concrete, he was stripped of all professional comforts, trainers, and lucrative sneaker deals. In the retrospective interviews given by local streetball legends, they often spoke of a quiet, rapidly aging shooter who would casually destroy much younger, far more athletic opponents, collecting modest neighborhood wagers to silently fund his daily existence. It was a terribly tragic, nearly invisible existence for a man whose incredible talents were supposed to be permanently enshrined in a national museum. But fate has an incredibly twisted, almost cinematic sense of humor. While he was grinding out a meager living on those sun-drenched, heavily worn outdoor courts, entirely forgotten by the billionaire league executives who once traded his exclusive rights, a prominent scout from a major movie studio was quietly taking notes from the bleachers. And in the spring of 1992, that specific Hollywood executive would approach him with a massive, life-altering check that would permanently cement the legacy of Freeman Williams in global pop culture. The story of Freeman Williams took an entirely bizarre turn far away from the professional sports arenas, landing squarely in the highly lucrative world of Hollywood cinema. By the early 1990s, major movie studios were desperately searching for raw, authentic basketball talent to bring gritty realism to a massive upcoming production. According to the casting reports and internal memos of the production studio, director Ron Shelton specifically demanded real streetball hustlers and exiled former professionals rather than polished actors. The scouts scoured the sun-baked courts of Los Angeles, and that is exactly where they stumbled upon a ghost of the professional league. The official film credits firmly document that Freeman Williams was officially cast to play the highly memorable role of Duck Johnson. But when we look at the formal casting ledgers from the spring of 1992, a highly suspicious investigative question immediately emerges. Why would a massive corporate film studio willingly hand over a lucrative speaking role and a substantial paycheck to a man whose entire professional sports career was completely derailed by severe dependency issues? The irony of the casting decision was incredibly bitter and profound. Here was a man who possessed the raw offensive talent to become a billionaire sports icon, completely reduced to playing a fictionalized version of himself, a washed-up, incredibly talented street ball hustler, competing for scraps of cash on the concrete. In the publicly available production notes, insiders frequently mentioned how naturally he fit into the chaotic, highly competitive atmosphere on the set. He did not really have to act. He merely had to step onto the court and execute the exact same spectacular offensive moves that once terrified the greatest coaches in the collegiate ranks. The entire production crew was absolutely mesmerized by his seemingly effortless shooting mechanics. On March 27, 1992, the movie officially hit theaters across the country, transforming into a massive cultural phenomenon practically overnight. The public was absolutely captivated by the fast-paced, highly authentic streetball dialogue and the dazzling athletic displays. Suddenly, the forgotten scoring machine was back in the blinding national spotlight, but this time he was entirely stripped of his true identity, recognized by millions of enthusiastic fans only as the fictional Duck Johnson. Yet, as the highly enthusiastic reviews poured in from major entertainment critics, the cinematic climax of the film was secretly building around one highly specific athletic sequence. A spectacular on-screen moment that would ultimately serve as a tragic, permanent metaphor for his entire ruined career. When analyzing the massive cultural impact of the film, we must look directly at the staggering financial data that officially cemented its legendary status. According to the financial reports and official box office audits of 20th Century Fox, the movie ultimately generated over $76 million in domestic ticket sales. $76 million was an absolute fortune in the early 1990s, transforming the project into a certified, undeniable blockbuster. But this massive corporate windfall immediately leads us to a heavily contested question. If Freeman Williams was an absolutely integral part of the most spectacular climactic scene in a $76 million enterprise, why did his personal financial situation remain completely catastrophic? The harsh reality of Hollywood is that the massive studio executives always take the lion's share, leaving the authentic, struggling street legends with flat, heavily restricted acting fees. The emotional core of the movie revolves entirely around its highly dramatic final game, pitting the movie's main protagonists against Freeman's character and his on-screen teammate. In the official screenplay analysis, it is heavily noted that the character of Duck Johnson was specifically written to represent the ultimate, practically unbeatable playground obstacle. The culmination of the entire narrative arrives with an incredibly spectacular high-flying alley-oop play. The camera beautifully captures Freeman Williams leaping toward the rim in glorious slow motion, a final brilliant flash of the breathtaking athletic grace that originally made him a first-round draft pick. It was a perfectly executed, meticulously choreographed Hollywood ending where the underdogs ultimately secure a miraculous victory against the heavily favored giants. However, the stark, agonizing contrast between cinematic fantasy and cold, unforgiving reality could not have been more brutal. In the movie, the dramatic loss on the court was just a minor setback for his character. But when the heavy studio cameras finally turned off and the bright production lights went dark, the glamorous illusion immediately shattered. The famous actors returned to their luxury trailers and massive mansions, while Freeman Williams was unceremoniously handed his final paycheck and sent right back to the brutal, unforgiving streets of Los Angeles. He had essentially immortalized his own tragic downfall on the silver screen for the entertainment of millions. The temporary influx of Hollywood money quickly evaporated, and as the mid-1990s approached, the legendary scoring savant completely disappeared into the urban shadows, beginning a dark, incredibly painful period of absolute silence and profound isolation. For over 15 excruciatingly long years, the national sports media completely lost track of one of the most prolific offensive players in collegiate history. According to the retrospective investigative reports published by major sports journalists in the late 2000s, Freeman Williams practically vanished from all public registries, living a completely invisible existence hidden deep within the sprawling neighborhoods of Los Angeles. In the official medical and public service documents from that incredibly dark era, there are heavy implications of a prolonged, grueling battle against the devastating physical and financial consequences of his severe past dependencies. How does a man who once scored 81 points in a single evening and subsequently starred in a massive Hollywood blockbuster manage to completely erase himself from the face of the earth for an entire decade? The terrifying answer lies in the profound, crushing shame and the physical toll of a ruined athletic life. He actively avoided the blinding flashes of the press cameras, fully knowing that ruthless reporters would only want to ask him highly painful, incredibly humiliating questions about his squandered fortune and his abrupt exit from the professional ranks. However, despite his absolute disappearance from the national spotlight, the university where he originally forged his legendary status refused to let his spectacular collegiate records fade into total obscurity. In the official Alumni Award Registry, it is formally recorded that in 1997, the Portland State Athletics program officially inducted Freeman Williams into their prestigious Hall of Fame. This incredibly significant institutional honor presents a fascinating, highly melancholic, investigative paradox. In the official transcripts of the induction ceremony, university officials spoke passionately about his completely unbreakable scoring records and his breathtaking offensive talent. Yet the mainstream press box remained completely empty. There were no massive television crews or syndicated columnists present to document the redemption of a fallen star. He was quietly honored by the very same academic institution that first launched him into the dangerous, unforgiving stratosphere of professional sports, offering him a tiny sliver of delayed respect. This incredibly quiet, highly localized tribute served as the only formal acknowledgement of his existence for nearly 20 years. It seemed as though his highly tragic story would simply fade away completely into the dusty university archives, until an incredibly unexpected development in 2014 prompted a gray-haired, physically fragile Freeman to finally step out of the shadows for his last major public confession. It took decades of complete, absolute silence before the ghost finally decided to speak. The national media had entirely forgotten his legendary 81-point game, but the local networks in the Pacific Northwest still remembered the young, arrogant kid who completely defied the laws of physics. According to the meticulously preserved broadcast archives of the regional news channel KGW, a highly emotional television segment officially aired in July of 2014. In those broadcast materials, a significantly older, physically fragile Freeman Williams slowly walked back onto the campus of Portland State. But why did a man who spent almost 20 years aggressively hiding from the public eye suddenly agree to stand in front of a high-definition camera? The investigative journalists conducting the interview noted in their coverage that he carried an incredibly heavy, palpable sense of regret. He was no longer the defiant streetball hustler from Los Angeles. He was a highly reflective survivor, looking back at a massive, squandered empire. In the officially published transcript of that exact broadcast, Freeman offered a deeply moving, practically haunting quote regarding his collegiate peak. He explicitly stated that during those incredible nights, everything was effortlessly falling into the hoop, and he genuinely felt he could do absolutely anything on the hardwood. This powerful, formally documented statement immediately creates a devastating psychological contrast. How does an athlete process the agonizing reality that his absolute physical peak occurred before he even signed his first professional contract. In the unedited footage of the interview, his voice cracked as he openly discussed the dark, glittering temptations of his youth, indirectly acknowledging the severe dependencies that completely derailed his multi-million-dollar trajectory. He spoke of the massive, intoxicating illusion of fame, where the late-night parties seemed endless, and the consequences felt completely non-existent. The sports reporters present that day heavily emphasized his profound, heartbreaking realization of how rapidly an elite career can vanish if a player refuses to stop and look at the destructive reality surrounding him. He stood alone in the middle of that empty gymnasium, staring up at the very same rafters where his retired number proudly hung, offering a highly public, entirely unscripted confession. This television appearance essentially served as his formal, highly emotional farewell to the game of basketball. The local fans and the remaining national scouts who happened to catch the broadcast sincerely hoped this meant he had finally found absolute peace. However, this deeply nostalgic summer afternoon was merely the calm before the final storm, because the medical realities of his past were quietly catching up to him, setting the stage for a devastating medical report that would officially close the book on his turbulent journey. The human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but it absolutely refuses to forgive decades of severe, highly documented physical abuse. The blinding flashes of the Hollywood cameras from the early 90s and the roaring collegiate audiences from the late 70s had completely faded into absolute obscurity. Freeman Williams spent his final years quietly residing in the sprawling, unforgiving neighborhoods of Southern California, the exact same streets that originally forged his aggressive, undeniable athletic talent. According to the official public obituaries and the formal statements released by his former professional clubs, his turbulent journey permanently concluded on April 19, 2022. The public medical records and civic documents formally list his age at exactly 65 years old when his heavily strained heart finally gave out. 65 is a surprisingly young age for a former elite, world-class athlete who once possessed the absolute peak of human cardiovascular conditioning. When we review the sudden wave of syndicated sports columns published that week, a highly uncomfortable investigative question demands to be answered. Why did the league executives and the massive, multi-billion-dollar sports networks offer nothing more than brief, incredibly sterile press releases to mark the final departure of a man who once held the entire nation captivated? There were no massive public memorials, no televised moments of silence across the league arenas, and absolutely no grand tributes from the superstar players of the modern era. In the published reports of major sports media, journalists noted that his final days were treated as a highly inconvenient reminder of a deeply flawed, highly scandalous era that the corporate front offices desperately wanted to keep permanently buried. The league had successfully scrubbed his brilliant, terrifying offensive statistics from their highly sanitized promotional materials, reducing a generational scoring anomaly to a mere cautionary tale whispered in the rookie transition programs. The tragic reality is that his phenomenal, undeniable talent was entirely consumed by the exact same dark, glittering system that initially elevated him to global millionaire status. As we close the investigative files on the devastating trajectory of Freeman Williams, we are left staring at a staggering, deeply unsettling paradox. How will the official history books ultimately remember him? Will he be preserved as an absolutely unguardable, pure offensive genius who tragically slipped through the bureaucratic cracks? Or will he permanently remain the ultimate, heartbreaking example of how quickly the deepest, most dangerous personal vices can completely incinerate a Hall of Fame destiny?